The private jet belonging to Blackthorne Aviation was minutes from takeoff when its chief executive, Vivienne Blackthorne, noticed a man in a faded work jacket sitting in a seat reserved for honored guests. She did not ask for his boarding pass. She simply turned to her security detail and ordered them to remove him so the seat could be given to a wealthy investor waiting in the terminal. The man did not resist. He only said calmly that the aircraft should not leave the runway that morning. A few passengers laughed at the warning, certain it came from a confused tradesman who had wandered onto the wrong plane. Then the cockpit door opened, the captain stepped out, looked at the man's face and went pale. 23 words left his mouth before anyone else could speak. "Mr. Pierce, is that really you?" If stories like this one, where quiet men outlast cruel boardrooms, are the kind that keep you listening until the final word, press subscribe now and stay with Nolan Pierce until the wheels finally leave the ground. Nolan Pierce arrived at Ashford Executive Airfield that morning in a pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on it, wearing a canvas jacket still faintly marked with engine grease from a job the night before. The terminal around him gleamed with marble floors and glass walls, the kind of building designed to remind every visitor exactly how much money it took to belong there. In his hand, he carried a sealed envelope bearing the wax stamp of the Blackthorne Board of Directors, a worn leather notebook filled with handwritten calculations, and a small case of tools he never traveled without, out of habit more than necessity. He had a boarding pass for Seat 4A on the inaugural demonstration flight of the Aurelian X, the company's newest and most expensive aircraft, though when the receptionist searched the digital manifest, his name did not appear. She called ahead twice, frowned at her screen, and finally waved him through because the authorization code stamped on his envelope was unmistakably real. Inside the cabin, dozens of investors, attorneys and senior executives sat in tailored suits sipping coffee from porcelain cups, the low murmur of confident conversation filling the air like background music at an exclusive party. Nolan took his seat without a word, immediately noticing a faint, irregular vibration rising through the floor panel near the rear of the fuselage, a sensation so subtle that anyone without his particular ear for machinery would never have noticed it at all. A financier named Lyle Prescott glanced at Nolan's jacket and asked a flight attendant, loudly enough for several rows to hear, whether the maintenance man would be leaving before departure. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the cabin, the kind of laughter that costs nothing to the people making it and everything to the person it lands on. Conrad Vail, the company's executive vice president, boarded next, dressed immaculately, and pretended not to recognize the man he knew perfectly well from 3 years earlier. He announced to the cabin, in a tone polished by years of practice, that ground crew had apparently allowed a maintenance contractor to board the wrong flight by mistake. Nolan offered his envelope, but Conrad waved it away without reading it and instructed the security team standing near the galley to be ready. As Nolan rested his hand against the armrest, he felt it again. 3 short pulses traveling through the structure of the aircraft, a signature he recognized instantly because he had warned the company about that exact pattern years before, in a report nobody had wanted to hear. Vivienne Blackthorne arrived shortly after with a small entourage and a public relations team trailing behind her, eager to capture the optimism of the morning. Conrad informed her that Lyle Prescott had requested an additional seat for his financial assistant, and since the cabin was already full, someone would need to be asked to leave. He gestured toward Nolan and described him in 4 damaging sentences: a contractor who had boarded using invalid paperwork, a former employee dismissed for breaching company security, and a man whose presence threatened the polished image of the flight. Vivienne did not examine the envelope in Nolan's hand. She looked instead at his worn jacket and accepted Conrad's version of events without hesitation, the way people in power often accept whatever confirms what they already expected to see. Nolan explained, without raising his voice, that he had been invited as an independent technical observer by Margaret Blackthorne, chair of the board, and Conrad immediately countered that Margaret was traveling overseas and unreachable for confirmation, a claim made with such confidence that nobody thought to question it. Vivian asked Nolan to leave the aircraft. He refused until someone verified the letter in his hand, and he added evenly that the tail section of the plane was producing an abnormal vibration pattern that deserved attention before departure. Vivian assumed this was retaliation from a disgruntled former employee, trying to sabotage a flight that represented years of work and billions of dollars in pending investment. In front of the assembled guests, she told him that past failures did not entitle him to threaten the company's future. Nolan answered quietly that the company's future would not last long if the aircraft left the ground in its current condition, and the comment was enough for Conrad to signal two security officers standing near the front of the cabin. The two men took hold of Nolan's arms, gently but firmly, preparing to walk him toward the exit. He did not pull away. He looked instead toward the cockpit and said one sentence loud enough for the captain to hear through the open door. "Ask your captain why the Trim 2 warning was deleted at 6:17 this morning." For a moment nobody moved. The cabin lights hummed faintly overhead, and somewhere beneath the floor the same three-pulse vibration returned, almost as if the aircraft itself were trying to second the warning Nolan had just spoken aloud. A flight attendant near the galley froze with a tray of coffee cups in her hands, unsure whether to continue serving or wait to see what happened next. Vivian's public relations director, standing near the rear bulkhead, quietly lowered his phone, sensing that whatever was unfolding in front of him was no longer a story worth recording for the company's social channels. Even Lyle Prescott, who moments earlier had mocked Nolan's jacket, leaned forward with new interest, the kind of attention wealthy men reserve only for things that might cost them money. The commotion brought Captain Everett Shaw out of the cockpit, and the moment he saw Nolan's face, he stopped completely still. For several seconds, nobody in the cabin spoke. Everett called him Mr. Pierce in a voice thick with disbelief, then ordered the security officers to release him immediately, his authority as captain overriding even the executive vice president standing a few feet away. Vivian asked how the captain knew this man, and Everett explained, briefly but firmly, that Nolan had once been his flight instructor in the Air Force, that Nolan had personally defended him against a false accusation that nearly ended his military career, and that Nolan had written the very recovery procedure used across multiple aircraft platforms to this day. Everett added that he would not take this plane into the sky if Nolan was telling him something was wrong. The mood inside the cabin shifted instantly. Passengers who had laughed minutes earlier began reconsidering their assumptions, glancing at Nolan with the particular discomfort of people realizing they had misjudged someone in front of an audience. Lyle Prescott asked, somewhat awkwardly, why a man of such reported expertise was dressed like a mechanic. Nolan answered simply that competence does not disappear just because a company strips away a title. Vivian, though still reluctant to delay her flight in front of investors, agreed to give Nolan 5 minutes for a visual inspection, hoping to settle the matter quickly and move forward with the demonstration. Nolan asked Everett directly about the warning from earlier that morning, and the captain confirmed that the Trim 2 indicator had illuminated for 3 seconds during pre-flight checks, that Conrad had dismissed it as a minor software glitch, and that the warning had since vanished entirely from the digital maintenance log, as though it had never occurred. Everett admitted, quietly enough that only Nolan could hear, that something about the dismissal had bothered him even at the time, though he had not wanted to make trouble on a morning the whole company had been preparing for months. Nolan asked who had authorized bypassing that warning, and Everett's eyes moved involuntarily toward Conrad. Nolan opened his worn notebook, read a string of numbers under his breath, and asked Everett to confirm whether the trim control unit beneath the tail ended in the digits 7719. Everett confirmed it without hesitation. Nolan closed the notebook and said the part had been banned from service 3 years earlier, a sentence that landed in the cabin like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Conrad immediately accused Nolan of fabricating the claim out of bitterness, insisting that bitterness, not engineering, was the true source of his testimony. Vivian asked the company's legal counsel, Dana Whitlock, to pull Nolan's old personnel file for verification. The digital record described him as a mid-level engineer terminated for unauthorized data access, for delaying the Aurelian program, for leaking internal documents to a competitor, and for costing the company millions of dollars, a portrait so damning that for a moment even Everett looked uncertain. Nolan said plainly that the file had been altered, and the story behind it unfolded in pieces as the cabin listened. 3 years earlier, Nolan had served as chief engineer of the Flight Control Systems Division, the architect behind several safety mechanisms still company-wide. During that time, he discovered that the trim control unit numbered 7719 could not withstand prolonged high hydraulic temperatures, a flaw confirmed by the supplier's own incomplete certification data. He remembered staying late into the night running thermal simulations on his own initiative, convinced that the numbers the supplier had submitted simply did not add up, and he remembered the quiet satisfaction of finally proving himself right, a satisfaction that curdled within days into something far darker. Conrad pushed to use the part anyway, since it cost 38% less than the certified alternative and would shorten the production timeline considerably. Arguments that sounded reasonable in a boardroom, but meant nothing once weighed against the lives the aircraft would eventually carry. Nolan refused to sign off on it, and within a week his work account was used, without his knowledge, to send proprietary data to an outside firm. Conrad used the incident as grounds for immediate dismissal, and nobody at the company paused to ask why a man with 2 decades of spotless service would suddenly commit an act so clearly against his own interests, an oversight that, in hindsight, looked less like carelessness and more like convenience. At the time, Nolan's wife, Rachel, was undergoing treatment for a serious illness, and losing his position meant losing supplemental insurance and most of the family's savings at the worst possible moment. Nolan never publicly blamed the company for what happened next, but he abandoned any legal fight against his termination in order to care for Rachel and their daughter during her final months. There were nights in those last months when Nolan sat beside Rachel's hospital bed reviewing maintenance manuals on a borrowed laptop, simply to keep his hands busy, refusing to let despair consume the hours he still had with her. He never told her how the company had treated him, choosing instead to let her final memories of his career remain untouched by bitterness. After Rachel passed away, Nolan took freelance maintenance work wherever he could find it, choosing stability over vindication for the sake of the 16-year-old daughter he now raised alone, learning to braid hair from online videos at midnight and to sign school permission slips between odd jobs that paid by the hour rather than the title. Conrad insisted that personal tragedy did not transform an accusation into proven fact, and Vivian, though still uncertain whom to believe, began noticing something strange. Conrad seemed to know far more specific details about Nolan's old department than a man who claimed, minutes earlier, not to recognize him at all. She asked how he knew which division Nolan had worked in, and Conrad answered vaguely that the memory had simply come back to him, an explanation thin enough that even the investors nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Dana confirmed that the invitation letter in Nolan's possession was authentic, signed 3 days earlier by Margaret Blackthorne herself, yet his name had been removed from the digital guest, manifest only 2 hours before departure, using credentials traced back to Conrad's own office. Everett formally announced his refusal to take off until the entire trim system underwent inspection, and Conrad threatened to replace him with another pilot on short notice. Everett responded that Conrad was welcome to take the captain's seat himself, but that no one could force him to certify a flight he did not believe was safe. Vivian, faced with a furious investor and a defiant captain, ordered the aircraft towed back into the hangar, drawing visible frustration from several guests who worried that any delay might jeopardize the $2.4 billion investment hanging on the success of this very flight. Lyle Prescott warned that if the demonstration did not happen that day, his firm's commitment could quietly slip away, and Vivian found herself caught between corporate reputation, financial pressure, a captain's refusal, and a stranger's warning that was steadily proving harder to dismiss. Inside the hangar, Dana established a controlled inspection process, with continuous camera recording, 2 company engineers as witnesses, and a remote insurance representative monitoring the procedure, ensuring nothing Nolan touched could later be disputed. The hangar itself smelled of jet fuel and cold metal, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly against the silence of everyone waiting to see what the rear panel might reveal. Nolan worked methodically, the way he always had, narrating each step aloud for the recording rather than rushing toward a conclusion he had not yet earned. When the rear access panel opened, Nolan immediately recognized the 7719 unit installed exactly where he had once warned it should never be placed. Conrad insisted the part had been recertified under new standards, but Nolan pointed out a small, telling flaw. The manufacturing code stamped on the certification tag used a typeface that did not exist when this particular unit was supposedly produced. A serial number lookup confirmed the deeper truth. This exact unit had been flagged years earlier with an internal classification reading, in plain terms, that it was meant to be destroyed after failing testing. It should never have existed inside any aircraft, let alone one preparing to carry dozens of investors into the sky. An engineer pulled the original maintenance log from backup storage, and although the morning's warning entry had been deleted from the visible record, the backup retained the name of the person who approved bypassing it. The name displayed clearly on the screen was Conrad Vale, and for the first time that morning, his composure cracked just slightly at the edges. While reviewing the aircraft's flight software, Nolan discovered a prepared contingency document hidden within the system, designed to activate automatically if a Trim 2 failure occurred during flight. The document would attribute any resulting incident entirely to pilot error, listing Everett Shaw as the sole party responsible for operational decisions, while conspicuously omitting Conrad's name from the approval chain entirely. Everett realized, with a cold and sudden clarity, that he had been positioned as the scapegoat, exactly as Nolan once had been 3 years before. Vivian asked Nolan why he continued protecting a company that had destroyed his career and his family's stability, and Nolan answered simply that he was not protecting the company at all. Only the people who were about to board this aircraft, trusting that it was safe. For the first time since stepping aboard the plane, Vivian had nothing to say in return. Conrad shifted tactics, accusing Nolan of planting falsified data during the inspection, an accusation Dana quickly dismantled by confirming Nolan had never been granted access to the central computer terminal. Unable to discredit the evidence, Conrad turned instead to discrediting the man, mentioning Nolan's financial debts, his daughter's looming tuition costs, and a long-forgotten compensation request filed after his original dismissal, framing all of it as motive for extortion. His tone never rose above a calm, almost sympathetic register, The kind of voice executives practiced for exactly these moments, as though he were reluctantly sharing painful truths rather than manufacturing a smear in real time. Nolan acknowledged his financial struggles openly but reminded the room that poverty was not evidence of fraud, while genuine fraud, the kind hidden behind expensive suits and corporate titles, rarely announced itself so plainly. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he had never once asked for money since the day he left the company, and that the only thing he had come back for that morning was a working airplane and an honest conversation, both of which had proven harder to find than he expected. During a brief pause in the proceedings, Nolan's daughter, Paige, called to ask whether he would make it home in time for her scholarship interview that evening. He stepped just outside the hangar doors to take the call, the morning air cool against his face after hours under fluorescent light. He told her only that he was trying to stop an unsafe aircraft from taking off, careful not to draw her further into the unfolding conflict. Paige answered with the kind of clarity teenagers sometimes offer without realizing its weight, telling him simply to do what he had always taught her, which was never to sign his name to something he knew was wrong. There was a brief pause on the line, and then she added that she would be fine waiting a little longer if it meant he was doing the right thing, a sentence that steadied something in Nolan's chest more than he expected it to. The call ended quickly, and Nolan returned his attention to the hangar floor with renewed resolve. Dana's investigation soon uncovered that the supplier behind Unit 7719 operated under the name Vale Aerodynamic Solutions, its true ownership obscured behind several shell companies before tracing back, ultimately, to Conrad's own younger brother. Over 3 years, Blackthorn Aviation had paid this hidden supplier more than $86 million for components that should never have passed inspection, a sum so large, it explained, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly why Conrad had fought so hard to keep the truth buried. Margaret Blackthorn joined the unfolding crisis by video call, confirming that she had personally invited Nolan after receiving an anonymous package of documents detailing the use of uncertified parts. Her image flickered slightly on the conference screen, the time zone behind her clearly marking late evening, yet her voice carried the same unhurried authority that had guided the company through 3 decades of turbulence. She had deliberately kept Vivian uninformed, suspecting that sensitive information leaving the executive office was somehow reaching Conrad before it reached anyone who might act on it. Vivian felt the sting of that admission deeply, realizing even her own family had quietly decided she could not be trusted with the full picture. Margaret told her plainly that holding power did not guarantee honesty from the people around her. It only guaranteed that those people would tell her whatever she wanted to hear. And she added, more gently, that recognizing this lesson early was a gift most executives only learned after a far more public disaster. Dana laid out the full case against Conrad for the assembled executives: the deleted guest record, the falsified certification tag, the erased warning log, the shell company tied to his family, the pre-written report designed to blame Everett, and the $86 million funneled through fraudulent contracts. Vivian asked Conrad directly whether he wished to explain himself, and rather than confessing, he doubled down, arguing that the flight needed to proceed to protect thousands of jobs, that the part had never actually caused a real accident, that Nolan simply failed to understand the pressures of running a global company, and that every major corporation accepted calculated risk as the cost of progress. Nolan answered that risk only existed honestly when people knew the truth and chose for themselves. Concealing a defect and loading passengers onto a plane anyway was not risk at all. It was deception wearing risk's clothing. Vivian, hearing her own earlier decision reflected back at her, recognized that she had dismissed Nolan from this very aircraft using the same careless certainty Conrad had used against him 3 years prior. She suspended Conrad on the spot, but he responded with a confident, almost amused warning that the board might not stand behind her once a $2.4 billion deal collapsed because of this morning's chaos. He predicted she would lose her position as chief executive before the day ended, and Margaret announced an emergency board session within the hour, leaving Conrad enough time and enough remaining allies to potentially reverse the entire situation and push the flight forward under a different crew entirely. Vivienne asked Nolan to address the board directly, but he refused if the meeting's only purpose was preserving her job rather than protecting passengers. He set conditions before agreeing to participate, that the full body of evidence be forwarded to federal aviation safety investigators, that engineers previously silenced or threatened receive protection rather than punishment, that no settlement be used to quietly bury the matter, that the aircraft remain grounded until an independent certification review occurred, and that Everett's name appear nowhere near any fabricated blame report. Vivienne agreed to every condition without negotiation, a notable departure from how she had handled the morning so far. Together, Nolan and Everett examined the aircraft's flight data recorder and discovered that Conrad had ordered an entire sensor channel disabled. The cockpit smelled faintly of solvent and warm electronics as Everett scrolled through line after line of code, occasionally pausing to ask Nolan to explain a term he had not encountered since his training days. Fortunately, the recovery system Nolan had designed years earlier contained an independent backup memory, undocumented in any commercial manual, originally added specifically to prevent safety data from disappearing during power failures. That hidden memory held 17 separate Trim 2 warnings recorded over the previous 6 months, 3 documented instances of temperature exceeding safe limits, 1 episode of incorrect automatic adjustment, several internal emails demanding the program be paused, and Conrad's own digital signature dismissing every single warning that came before it. Lyle Prescott, growing increasingly uneasy, asked Nolan whether simply replacing the faulty unit might allow the flight to continue as planned. Nolan told him the problem no longer rested with a single component. The entire certification process itself had been manipulated from the inside. If Prescott invested before the truth became public, his fund risked becoming an unwitting financier of corporate fraud, a possibility serious enough that he immediately withdrew his support for Conrad and instead demanded that Nolan be given a full hearing before the board. Just before that meeting began, the hidden backup memory was suddenly and remotely locked, and the account responsible for the command traced directly to the executive office belonging to Vivienne herself. A technician's hands hovered uselessly over the keyboard for a moment, unsure whether to announce the discovery aloud or quietly hope someone else would notice first. Every eye in the room turned toward her at once, and for a moment it seemed the very evidence meant to clear her was now being used to bury her instead. Conrad seized the opportunity, claiming that Vivienne had personally authorized the very systems now under suspicion, and that the entire scandal was nothing more than an attempt to deflect blame onto him. Digital signatures bearing her name did, in fact, appear across several damaging documents, and Vivienne insisted, with growing desperation, that she had never read or signed a single one of them. Nolan recognized the pattern immediately. It mirrored precisely what had been done to him 3 years earlier, an executive's authority quietly hijacked by someone with access to credentials they should never have controlled. Conrad, it turned out, had been using a senior assistant's system permissions to replicate signatures belonging to executives far above his official rank. Nolan now faced a choice that tested the very principles he had been defending all morning. If he stayed silent, Vivienne might lose her position entirely, perhaps even face investigation for fraud she did not commit. This from the very woman who, only hours earlier, had ordered him dragged off the aircraft without so much as glancing at his invitation. Everett quietly asked whether Nolan intended to help her at all, and Nolan answered that the truth did not change, simply because the person it now protected had once treated him poorly. He compared the timestamps on the falsified documents against Vivienne's known travel schedule and found that one approval had supposedly been signed while she was mid-flight internationally, disconnected entirely from any secure network capable of authorizing it. Dana cross-referenced the authentication logs and confirmed the signatures originated from a device assigned to Conrad's personal assistant, the very same device used to lock the hidden backup memory only minutes earlier. The board session convened with this new revelation hanging over the room, and Conrad attempted one final maneuver, portraying Nolan as a manipulator who had somehow coerced or deceived the chief executive into turning against her own company. He revisited Nolan's old dismissal file and his current financial hardship, hoping the optics alone might sway undecided board members. Nolan did not defend himself with grand declarations. Instead, Everett stood and told the board about a young pilot who had nearly lost his military career over a fabricated mechanical failure years earlier, and how Nolan had fought for the truth even though doing so cost him a promotion he had rightfully earned. Margaret presented the original invitation letter as proof of her own involvement from the beginning, and Dana methodically walked the board through every piece of technical evidence collected that morning. Despite the overwhelming presentation, the board remained sharply divided, several members visibly torn between the documented evidence in front of them and the staggering financial cost of walking away from the investment now hanging by a thread. Conrad offered what he framed as a reasonable compromise: conduct a short demonstration flight immediately, and if the aircraft performed normally, treat Nolan's claims as exaggerated concern rather than confirmed danger. Several board members, eager to salvage the morning's investment opportunity, leaned toward accepting Conrad's proposal, murmuring among themselves about deadlines and shareholder expectations, as though the conversation had already drifted away from the question of safety entirely. Nolan refused to gamble human lives to settle an argument that could be resolved without anyone leaving the ground at all. And he said so plainly, reminding the room that no spreadsheet was worth a single life lost proving a point that could be proven on solid concrete instead. He proposed an alternative: a controlled thermal stress test performed entirely inside the hangar, with the aircraft secured in an engine testing bay, simulating long-haul flight conditions while cycling hydraulic temperatures upward in carefully monitored stages, comparing genuine sensor readings against what the onboard system reported in real time, all of it recorded through independent equipment beyond anyone's ability to quietly alter afterward. Conrad objected immediately, recognizing instantly that such a test would expose the defective unit beyond any possibility of denial. The test began under tense silence. In its earliest minutes, every displayed reading appeared entirely normal, and Conrad allowed himself a faint, confident smile, suggesting Nolan had wasted the board's valuable time on nothing. The test bay's overhead heaters cycled steadily upward, the low mechanical hum filling the hangar as dozens of board members and investors watched a wall of monitors instead of the sky outside. Vivienne stood near the control station with her arms crossed tightly, unwilling to let her expression betray how much she had already begun to fear Nolan was right. But as hydraulic temperatures climbed toward the exact threshold Nolan had warned about years before, the unit numbered 7719 began reporting falsely stable data, even as independent instruments showed the stabilizer actually shifting out of position. The aircraft's main computer issued no warning whatsoever. Worse still, it began sending incorrect automatic correction commands based entirely on the faulty readings. Someone in the crowd gasped audibly as the secondary monitor, wired directly to Nolan's own independent sensors, began flashing red while the primary display continued to show a calm, untroubled green. Everett confirmed grimly that at cruising speed, a pilot would have only a few seconds to react before losing meaningful control of the aircraft's pitch. Nolan activated the very system he had designed years earlier, the Pierce Recovery Protocol, and watched as it isolated the failing unit and guided the stabilizer back into a safe position before the simulated failure could spiral further. The room exhaled all at once, a collective release of breath that had been held without anyone quite noticing. As the engineering logs printed out, Nolan's name appeared clearly listed as the original author of the recovery code, embedded permanently within the system's architecture in a place Conrad had never managed to erase, no matter how thoroughly he had scrubbed the company's official records. The board members realized almost simultaneously that Nolan was no longer simply a former mid-level engineer with a grievance. The very technology that had just prevented a catastrophic failure inside their own hangar belonged to him. Invented by the man Conrad had spent years quietly erasing from company history while using his work without acknowledgement. The demonstration flight had only avoided becoming a tragedy because Nolan happened to be recognized before security finished dragging him off the plane, a fact that would haunt several board members long after the meeting adjourned. Vivian called for an immediate board vote to remove Conrad permanently and to forward every piece of collected evidence directly to federal investigators, a motion that passed this time without meaningful resistance. Conrad was terminated from his position, stripped of system access, and the contracts connecting Blackthorn Aviation to Vale Aerodynamic Solutions were suspended pending formal review. Every aircraft in the Aurelian fleet was grounded until full independent inspections could be completed, and the assembled documentation was handed over to authorities for investigation. There was no physical confrontation as Conrad left the building. The same two security officers who had once gripped Nolan's arms now simply escorted Conrad toward the exit. In silence, the hangar quiet except for the echo of his footsteps against the concrete. Before leaving, Conrad accused Nolan of destroying the company and the livelihoods of thousands of employees who depended on it, his voice finally losing the polish it had carried all morning. Nolan answered quietly that he had destroyed nothing. He had only stopped Conrad from using innocent passengers to hide what he had already done, and he did not raise his voice to say it, because by that point there was nothing left to prove. Standing before employees, investors, and a small cluster of journalists, Vivian admitted publicly that she had judged Nolan by his clothing rather than his credentials, that she had ordered him removed from the aircraft without bothering to verify a legitimate invitation, that she had trusted Conrad simply because his words conveniently aligned with what the company wanted to hear, and that she had allowed corporate reputation to take precedence over a clear warning about passenger safety. Her voice did not waver, even when a reporter asked whether the admission might invite further lawsuits against the company. She answered that hiding the truth had already cost more than any lawsuit ever could, and that she would rather lose money than lose the right to call her own company honest. She insisted the apology be formally recorded as part of the company's official statement rather than offered quietly behind closed doors, a decision that surprised even Margaret, who had expected far less candor from her niece. Vivian offered Nolan reinstatement as Vice President of Flight Safety, a substantial financial settlement, company shares, direct reporting access to the board, and formal recognition that his name be permanently attached to the very recovery system bearing his work. She laid out the offer carefully, almost nervously, watching his face for some sign of how he might respond, aware that no amount of money could undo 3 years of quietly carrying a label he never deserved. Nolan did not accept immediately. He told her that before discussing his own role, the company first needed to restore the reputations of every engineer who had been pressured into silence over the years, some of whom had lost careers far quieter than his own, simply for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. Vivian asked whether he could ever trust Blackthorn Aviation again after everything that had happened, and Nolan answered honestly that it depended entirely on whether she intended to fix one broken aircraft or fix the broken culture that had allowed it to exist in the first place. In the months that followed, the investigation confirmed everything Nolan had uncovered inside that hangar. Conrad had falsified certification records, funneled tens of millions of dollars through a hidden family-owned supplier, altered Nolan's old personnel file to manufacture grounds for his original dismissal, forged executive signatures including Vivian's own, and intimidated multiple engineers into silence over the years, rather than risk losing his position. Investigators later discovered that at least 3 other employees had quietly resigned under similar pressure during Conrad's tenure, each one warned that speaking up would end their career the same way it had ended Nolan's. Conrad and several of his associates faced formal charges related to fraud and obstruction, their once polished reputations unraveling far faster than they had been built, and the financial press spent weeks dissecting exactly how a man so trusted by the board had operated unchecked for so long. Blackthorn Aviation recalled every unit numbered 7719 still installed across its fleet, established a fully independent safety oversight board insulated from executive interference, compensated Nolan for both his original wrongful termination and his role in preventing further harm, publicly corrected the falsified record that had haunted his career for 3 years, restored his name to the patent filings for the recovery system he had created, and quietly reached out to the engineers who had once been pushed out for raising concerns nobody wanted to hear, offering each of them the chance to return on their own terms. Nolan ultimately declined the full-time vice president position, choosing instead to serve as independent director of safety, a role granting him the authority to ground any flight himself without requiring approval from the chief executive's office. He had thought carefully about the decision over several quiet evenings at his kitchen table, weighing the comfort of a familiar title against the freedom of never again having to answer to someone who might one day decide convenience mattered more than honesty. The arrangement also allowed him a schedule flexible enough to remain present for his daughter, whose scholarship interview, in the end, went exactly as well as she had hoped it would, a small victory that meant more to him than any boardroom vote ever could. He used a portion of his settlement to establish a scholarship fund for the children of mechanics and ground crew workers who dreamed of studying aviation engineering themselves, the kind of opportunity that had once felt entirely out of reach for someone wearing his old jacket. When the Aurelian X was finally cleared for a new demonstration flight, the event looked nothing like the one that had nearly ended in disaster months before. There were no flashing cameras staged for spectacle, no executive quietly pulling rank to clear a seat for someone wealthier, and no engineer left waiting outside while investors filled every available row first. This time, the mechanics and ground crew who had spent months repairing the company's reputation from the inside were invited to board before anyone else. Every safety record from the recall was published in full, and nothing about the flight's preparation was hidden from view. Reporters who had once covered the scandal with skepticism now stood at a respectful distance, observing rather than hunting for a headline, a small but telling sign of how much the company's relationship with the public had shifted in the months since. Nolan walked up the boarding stairs wearing the same worn jacket he had arrived in on that very first morning. A young attendant, new to the company, politely asked whether he would prefer something more formal for the occasion. Nolan smiled faintly and told her that the old jacket had taught him exactly who saw the person standing in front of them and who only ever saw a title. Vivian herself stood waiting at the cabin door. personally returning his boarding pass into his hand rather than leaving the gesture to an assistant. And seat 4A remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and unclaimed by anyone else in the month since. Everett emerged from the cockpit, shook Nolan's hand firmly, and asked with a faint smile whether he was finally ready to fly. Nolan glanced over the instrument panel, checked the readouts methodically out of old habit, and answered simply that now he was. Outside the small windows, the early sun caught the polished fuselage, and somewhere behind them, mechanics who had once been afraid to speak up about safety concerns now stood in the cabin doorway, watching the man who had given them their voice back settle into the same seat he had been dragged from months before. The aircraft rolled slowly toward the runway under a clear morning sky, carrying the same man who, not long ago, had been pulled by his arms toward an exit door by people who never bothered to ask his name. This time, he was the only person on board with the authority to decide whether it was truly safe to leave the ground at all, and for the first time in 3 long years, nobody questioned why.